Let me begin by looking at Christ's approach to community work. Whenever Jesus wanted to make a point, he often told a story. And one of his most famous stories was the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, can anybody tell me a little bit about what that's about? Like, for example, when was that set? What point was that set in? Yeah, so set in the day of judgment, at the future, like at the end of history, isn't it? Okay. And it envisages Jesus as the human one who has come back to judge humanity. Okay? Is that right? All right. Now, what's this bit about the sheep and goats? What's that got to do with that particular story? What does he say about the sheep and goats? Who are they? What do they represent?
People and the choices they make.
Okay, great. The sheep and the goats represent people and the choices that they make. And don't forget, this was a Middle Eastern context. It's not Australia or New Zealand where you can tell easily the difference between a sheep and goats. In that context, it's very hard to tell the difference between sheep and goats. From a distance, you can't tell. They look the same. And that's a really important part of this story. It's about separating people based on the choices that they make that don't immediately look very different or seem very different. The difference aren't necessarily immediately observable, right? So it's set at the day of judgment. Jesus comes back as the human one to judge humanity, and he separates people into two categories based on their choices. Who are the sheep and who are the goats? Who do they represent? What kind of choices do they represent?
Sheep served and care and look out for others.
And the goats didn't. Yes, that's right. They said but. So they're not actually... that's what distinguishes them from the sheep. So, okay, so the sheep are the good guys and the goats are the bad guys. That's right? Yeah, in the story, isn't it? Yeah, so it separates. Now, what is the criteria that Jesus uses for making his decision about separating these people into good guys and bad guys?
How they treated the least.
Okay.
People around them.
Exactly. So the criteria Jesus uses at the end of history for his judgment, when he's making judgments about people, as to whether they were good or bad, is how they treated the least. That's right. Now, I think that's quite fascinating. I mean, how do we explain this? Isn't God concerned about everybody? Why doesn't he say, look, the criteria should be about how you treated everybody? Right? If you were nice to everybody, it's okay. If you weren't nice to everybody, that's not okay. Now, isn't God committed equally to everybody? Wouldn't that make sense that would be the criteria? Why, when Jesus comes back to judge the world, does he say, the crucial issue is the way you have treated the least? Why does he do that? What sense do you make of that? How is that just?
Well, it's the majority.
Sorry?
It's the majority, the least.
Okay, so you're saying it's how we treated the majority of the people, and the majority of the people in the world are poor, hungry, homeless. Okay, there's a degree of legitimacy to that. The difficulty is, it's not everybody, is it? So, where is the justice in that?
I guess we treat everyone around us who are similar to us quite well, but it's the really poor people or the really needy people that we don't get down to.
Okay, so you're saying it's not just a matter that they may form the majority of people. Our treatment of that majority is an indicator of our values, that in fact they are the test of whether in fact we are really relating well to everybody, because they test how we relate to that particular group.
Yeah, we're good on 90% maybe, but that final 10% or we're good on 60%, but not that.
And why is that so important?
love everyone.
Right. Yeah, and that's the whole point. That's the whole point. God loves everybody equally. He's concerned about the way we relate to everyone, and he is particularly concerned about those that we are not particularly concerned for. Is that clear? So he actually says that the criteria that he will use to judge us is based on his concern for his love for everybody. But he's particularly concerned about those people that are normally left out in our general regard for the welfare of everybody. Right? Now, in this story, he begins to unpack different descriptors of those kind of people that we tend to ignore, tend to neglect, tend to reject. What are some of the descriptors that he uses of those people? What is their predicament?
Hungry.
So they're hungry, so, yes? They're naked, they're thirsty, they're in prison, they're sick. That's right. So the interesting thing I think about this is that Jesus isn't actually using a class analysis. He doesn't actually use the language of the poor here. It's not poor as opposed to the rich. His descriptors really are people who cannot access basic needs. And those people may be rich or they may be poor. In fact, I'd like to suggest to you that there are the least from the very top to the very bottom of society. Is that clear? Who are some of the least at the top of society who cannot access their basic needs that might fit this category of the least that Jesus is concerned about?
Thirsty ones who are always aware that there's something missing, that there's something that is not satisfying in their lives.
That may be true, but don't forget he's actually using a physical language here about, yeah. So it may be true metaphorically.
The mentally impaired.
That's right. So you're starting to look at people who actually do not have the capacity to engage intellectually, who are psychiatrically disturbed, people who may be abused, people who may be subject to domestic violence, right? People who may be addicted, right? May be disabled, and those people are from the top to the bottom of society, right? They're there everywhere, in every church, in every community. Those that most of us consider least. Is that clear? Yep. Having said that, however, where are most of the people that most consider least? At the top or the bottom? At the bottom, yes. So in fact, if we were to draw a diagram here, say, of the world, and these are the rich, these are the upper middle class, these are the middle class, here's the lower middle class, here's the underclass, okay, and this is the rest. You've probably got few of the people at the top who are among the least, but the majority of those people who are the least are among the poorest of the poor, right? Now, it's very interesting that that Jesus would seem to suggest that on the day of judgment, we're going to be judged for the weight that we relate to the least. Because generally, if you look at the distribution of Christian workers in the world, where are they? At which level do we find, say, in places like Australia and New Zealand, where are most of the trained Christian workers? At which level? At which level? Middle. Yeah, I reckon from there upwards, that's where most of us are. Why is that?
Because they can afford us.
Because they can afford us. No, that is exactly right. They can actually pay for our salaries. That is significant. That is highly significant, right? Which is why Jesus says you can only serve God or mammon, but not both. If you allow money to be the determining factor, you will not reflect the priorities of God. Do you understand that? It's very clearly. The other reason is that we have a career path within Christian groups and organisations that reflects and reinforces the dominant values. So even if you start out with a poor group of people in a struggling church, as you develop your knowledge and skills, you become more upwardly mobile. And a bigger and a better church takes you on. And so, in fact, not only are the majority of Christian workers up in that section, but anybody that starts out here tends, and does well, tends to move up and away from those people. And so then we've got people, the whole modelling in our culture, not in just our general culture, but our religious culture, is not towards these people, but away from them. When you get crazy groups like servants coming along and saying, oh, we've got to be with the poor, we've got to work along the poor, you go, yeah, but how many people have you got in your mission? Right? Hardly anybody. Right? Because nobody in their right mind wants to go and do that kind of stuff. Right? We've gone to university, we've been to seminary, we've developed our knowledge and skills. We want to sell our capacity to the highest bidder. I mean, do you understand that? Huh? So there's a constant movement away from those people that need us most. Is that true?
Yeah.
Now, I would like to suggest that if we're going to actually do what Christ wants us to do and engage the world at large in a way that reflects his love, but particularly the people that are most marginalised and disadvantaged, that we need to be converted all over again. Let me explain what I mean. Okay. These are categories that you may be familiar with. Who do we tend to put first? Just generally. Ourselves, that's right. Who do we tend to put last? Others. Okay, so we become a Christian. Now we know we're meant to actually to care for others. Who do we tend to put first among the others? And then who do we tend to put last? Yes, those that we relate to. So people that are like us, so either are like us or do like us, right? The ones that it's easier for us to relate to. So, yeah. And we develop whole schools of mission around that. Kind of homogeneous church growth, for example. Okay. So, and then we relate to people that are not like us last, or who don't like us. All right? Is that right? But say we get filled with the Spirit, okay, right? And we're no longer a nice middle-of-the-road evangelical Christian. Now we're a super-duper charismatic or Pentecostal Christian, okay? And now we are going to go for it. And we're going to relate to these people who don't like us, right? And who are not like us, right? And a lot of the mission in the world today is coming out of charismatic and Pentecostal groups, crossing those divides. Who do we tend to relate to first out of that group? And who do we tend to relate to last?
Those we can make like us.
Thank you. Those that we can make like us. So that's very good. So let me just slightly change the language. The people that we feel hopeful about, and so we get whole schools of mission around responsive populations, right? So we invest with the hope that we'll get a return on our time and energy and money, right? Isn't that right? And the ones we relate to last are the hopeless. The people Jesus called the least. Now, we may, as evangelical Christians and charismatic Christians, have those people on our agenda. The reality is, when it comes to operating, more often than not, we just never get around to relating to them because they're not our priority. We'd like to help if we could, but we just never have the time or energy or money to do it. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? What Jesus calls us to do is to put the last first and the first last. Are you familiar with that terminology? Now, for me, that is a profound conversion. For most of us, it requires being converted all over again. To put the people at the bottom of the heap on the top of our priorities requires a profound conversion. Now, let's say we do that. What kind of things does Jesus suggest in this parable we can do for these people to express his love for them?
Basic needs.
Meet their basic needs. Like giving somebody a drink, sharing a meal, going for a visit. Now, I think this is very interesting. He doesn't say here that you will be judged on whether you can heal the sick. He doesn't say you'll be judged on whether you can raise them from the dead. He doesn't say you'll be judged on the basis of whether you can change the course of human history, whether you can develop a multi-million-dollar welfare agency that provides a range of services. He doesn't say that, does he? Does he? Which is just as well, because most of us can't do it. Isn't that true? Most of us can't do it. We have these spectacular stories and we get excited about them, and some people seem to be able to do it, but I can't. The good news is, in the story is that we're only going to be judged on the basis of what we can do.
Hallelujah.
Isn't that right? Which of these things can't you do? Which of these things can't you do? Any? None. You can all give somebody a drink. You can all give somebody a meal. You can all give somebody a bed. You can all visit the sick. You can all go to the prison. It's all doable. We're not going to be judged on the basis of what we can't do, but whether we do what we can do or not. Is that clear? Huh? That's clear. Is that reasonable? Is that fair? Yeah. Now, what I'd like to look at is 5 different ways that Jesus tried to meet people's basic needs. The first is what we call relief. Relief is where you meet others' needs yourself. The classic example is the feeding of the 4,000, 5,000. The people are hungry. Jesus turns to the disciples and says, "Why don't you give them something to eat?" They freak out and say, "What?" But Jesus seemed to have this expectation that we should be able to meet people's needs out of our own resources. They're feeling so inadequate they don't do anything. But fortunately there's a naive young boy there who says, "Look, I've got a few loaves and fishes. Why don't we start with that?" And we know the story that Jesus blesses that, and that meets all the basic needs. But it's a classic example of relief, that people out of their own resources meet other people's needs. Okay, is that clear? The second way in which Jesus met people's basic needs is through education. So you train others to meet one another's needs. Now, this doesn't have to be formal, it can be quite informal. And the example is where Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house. They have a sit down for a meal together, and as a result of this conversation, Zacchaeus says, "I'm prepared to sell what I've got, give half of what I have to the poor, and pay those that I've ripped off 4 times what I've taken from them." And by the way, what does Jesus say to him at that point? Interesting, isn't it? Salvation has come to your house. Yes. The third way Jesus tried to meet people's needs is through confrontation, where you confront others who do not meet others' needs. the classic example of Jesus going into the temple, where the people are selling sacrifices at inflated prices. In fact, the people that he actually has a go at are the people who sell what? Doves. Yeah, and when Jesus went to the temple as a kid with his mum and dad, what did they buy? Doves. It's very interesting. I think he remembered. These people who didn't help the poor but exploited the poor. Jesus was mad about that. And he confronted them publicly. Right? The fourth way that Jesus tried to help people meet their basic needs was through what I call formation, or where you develop or form a model of self-help to meet people's basic needs. The classic example of that in the Gospels is the common purse. The common purse was as Laurie will tell you, is a finance co-op. You know, where people put in what they can afford and take out what they need. That's where Mark's got the whole idea from. Anyway, we won't go down that track. But what you've got here is a model of self-help, where you're actually modelling a way of people saving, providing ways of supporting each other through difficult times, right? And Jesus models that with his disciples. Is that clear? The fifth way that Jesus helped people was through what I call transformation, where people take on that model as a community and make it their own. Is that clear? In Acts 2 and Acts 4, when the Spirit comes, when there's renewal, when there's revival, there's the energy and enthusiasm and interest in taking that model of the common purse that the disciples had and making it a way of life for the early Christian community. Isn't that what happens in Acts 2 and 4? No one says what they have is their own, but whenever there's a need, they're prepared to sell it and share it so that, and this is one of the most amazing phrases in the whole of human literature, there was not one person in need in their community. That's there in the text. Check it out. That's incredible. Right? This is why the Spirit has come, to bring about this kind of change in society, so people's basic needs are met. Is that clear? Okay. I have a question to ask. In fact, I've got a couple of questions to ask. The first is, which do you think is the most important strategy for meeting people's basic needs? Just think about it for a moment. What is the most important strategy for meeting people's basic needs? Okay, responses. Formation, why?
Because you're enabling someone to spread wider than yourself.
Okay, good, great. Just hold that. Other people, what do you think? Yes?
Relief.
Relief because?
Doesn't depend on anybody else except you.
And so you can do it regardless of whether anybody helps or not. Okay, yep. Any other comments?
You could say confrontation because that's, again, it's wider.
Yes, right. And it's challenging the forces in society that are working against people, manipulation, exploitation, oppression. Yep. There's an argument for all of them, isn't there?
The most important is really all of them.
Yes, that's right. And why?
Because it depends on the basic needs of that group at that time, and I think the other variable is time.
That's right. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so all of these are important, right? If they weren't all important, Jesus wouldn't have practiced them. The critical issue is which one is appropriate at a particular time. If a person is in trouble, they're homeless, we may need to confront the people in public housing about not providing resources for them, but at that moment, relief, in fact, may be the most immediate need. They need a place to stay, right? At another time, we may have actually housed somebody in public housing and they've just wasted all their money gambling. And so they've got no money to pay the rent, right? So maybe what's most appropriate at that time is not relief or confrontation, but education, training them to budget, right? Is that clear? All right. So all of them are equally important, and the real challenge is to be spiritually sensitive to which strategy is appropriate to meet the basic need at that time. Is that clear? Okay. Now, here comes the big question. Now, it's very, very important you don't answer this straight away, right? The big question is, which of these strategies do you think Christian groups and organisations use most, and which ones do you think they use least? Okay. Which one do you think they tend to use most?
3.
3, do you think so?
Probably.
No. So, which one?
1 and 2.
So, people do use 3. Yeah, it's probably like that. 1. Definitely. And for the reasons that you're saying. Or was it you that was saying? Yeah, people can do it. They don't have to depend on anybody to do this. They can. Oh, that was you. You're saying that. Yeah. Then which ones after that? 2. That's right. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that they are the majority of the ones that we use, and we use that a bit. And maybe we try at this. And any time this happens, we call it revival. You know, just yeah, it's a big surprise to everybody. You know, we pray for it all the time, and when it happens, it takes us by surprise because it's so rare. Is that fair enough? Now that's very interesting. Now, okay, there used to be a guy by the name of Julius Sumner Miller. Did anybody used to see his programs? The program was called "Why Is It So?" So he put up an issue and he'd say to people, "Why is it so?" You may not have seen the program, but you are in it. And the question is, why is it so? If all of them are equally important, why do we have such an emphasis on 1 or 2 approaches and not on the others? The answer is what? The answers are what? Pardon? What do you want to say about hardest?
Transformation is the hardest one.
Yes, okay. So okay, let's put that up. So this is easier, and that is harder. What else?
We want to give education because it puts it back on other people's heads.
Okay. So that's a bit easier than having to do it ourselves.
Lets us off the hook.
Lets us off the hook a bit. Okay. So that makes that easier up that end, harder down there. What other things?
I think relief can make you feel good.
Okay. Yeah, so we feel good. There's tends to be immediate returns. And this is kind of feeling not so good often. And there's not usually immediate returns. What else?
What about the level of personal engagement?
Yes, tell me. What's the difference?
So I can go and give someone a food parcel and never see them again.
That's right.
I feel I've helped them. But if we're getting down to 5, I might be dealing with someone for, 3 years.
That's exactly right.
That's part of my life.
This is a quick fix. This is a slow process. This just depends on us. And this depends on others. Others.
Transformation requires the most profound internal change.
That's right. So this is more external, and this is more internal. Yep.
In transformation, you're making yourself vulnerable, whereas in the relief, there's no risk.
And I think this is the core issue. The core issue is in the strategy. Starting at the top, we're in total control. We decide what we give, when we give, how we give it. And if people don't treat us right, we don't give anymore. Because we are in control. We are in charge. Right? We are invulnerable. Each of those processes requires a greater degree of vulnerability where we share control. In education, we can challenge people, but they can challenge us in return. They can ask us questions. When we come to confrontation, we are taking on the powers that can kill us. Right? When we're getting into model formation, the pressure is not on anybody but us to show that we've got a viable alternative way, right? Right? And if it doesn't work, everybody will know. And when it comes to transformation, it is completely out of our control. Because ultimately, it depends on a work of the Spirit that we can't make happen. It's only as that group of people are open to the Spirit in the same way we are that they can participate in that degree of transformation. It's completely beyond our control. Right? Okay? Now, what I would like us to suggest is that if we are going to be truly free enough to be able to adopt whatever strategy is going to meet people's basic needs, we need to deal with the basic issues of control. In Galatians 5, it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, etc. But in among all those fruit, there's a little descriptor about control. Can anybody remember what it is? What kind of control? Self-control. It's not about anybody controlling us. It's not about us controlling anybody else. Is that right? But it's when the Spirit comes upon us, the Spirit wants to induce processes and structures that engender self-control. It's about us controlling ourselves, but it's also about us helping other people to control themselves. Right. And that requires an even greater conversion than being committed to working with the last and making the last first. Because what it means when we work with those people, it's about not manipulating and exploiting them in order to develop a program that will be seen to succeed, but it's about risking our reputation to be with people in the process, even when we don't control it, praying and hoping that they will take it on, they will be responsible, they will make it happen, because they are open to the Spirit. Is that clear? All right. Now, I want to give you a chance in a moment to form small groups and have a discussion. And what I want you to look at is the issue of what is the challenge in this for you? What kind of changes does this kind of agenda raise for you? Okay? Is it about putting the last first? Is that the serious issue? Is it about dealing with issues of control? Is it about becoming more aware of the strategies that Jesus uses to work with meeting people's basic needs? What is the challenge in this for you? But before we have that discussion, are there any questions you'd like to ask me? Any comments you'd like to make? Yes, Gwen.
Dave, could you comment on the least of my brothers?
Yes, in one part it says the least of my brothers, in the other part it doesn't. So I think it's significant that in one place it is and the other place it isn't. Now some people interpret the whole of it to be the least of my brothers, therefore it's talking about people who share the same faith as Jesus. That's how they frame it. But
some say the Jews particularly.
And yes, okay, and the Jews in particular. I think the whole point of it is exactly the opposite. Because Jesus tells this story to people who are shocked by the ending. In other words, they are shocked by the connection between Jesus and the groups that they're relating to, and that there's any connection between the way they relate to those people and to Jesus. Now, if it was people who shared the same faith as Jesus, they would be immediately aware that the way that they treat those people has an impact on Jesus. If it was about people of the same culture, tradition or religion, it's not such a shock. Right? It's obvious. Everybody knows those connections. No surprise. But the big surprise in this, for both the sheep and the goats, is that there's any connection between these kind of people that they're relating to and Jesus. There's no immediate obvious connection. And that would seem to suggest to me that the whole emphasis on this parable is that it's not talking about people who share the same faith as Jesus. It's not about the same culture, tradition or religion. It's about hey, surprise, surprise, these people that you think have no connection to me really matter to me, right? And the thing in it, I think that's interesting, is that the sheep are as surprised by that as the goats. They say, when did we ever know that? When did we ever? They didn't get it. We are fortunate that we have the text. We needn't be surprised. The good news is we can repent now rather than later. Isn't that right? Yeah, okay. Any other questions before we have the discussion?
You talked about number 5, transformation, and you talked about it relies on the Spirit to convict other people.
Yes.
Are you therefore dealing with other Christians rather than, say, relating to non-Christians?
No, I'm not. I don't think Christians have a monopoly on the Spirit. I think the Spirit of God works in the world, seeking to draw people to Him. When Jesus came along and preached about the coming of the Spirit, to preach good news to the poor, everybody assumed this was meaning the people of God, right? So everybody clapped and cheered. Oh, Jesus, you're terrific. You know, the Spirit of the Lord is upon you to preach good news to the poor. We're poor. That's for us. Terrific. But Jesus goes on to say, and by the way, this includes people like Naaman the leper, who was a Syrian, who God healed. And they go, what, you mean we don't have a monopoly on the Spirit? You're going to work with people who don't share the same religious traditions and culture and religion as us? Are you serious? And Jesus said, yes, I'm serious. And they said, kill him. Isn't that right? Wasn't that a response? Quickly, they turned from clapping Jesus and to killing him. Because every religious group in the world likes to think they've got a monopoly on the Spirit, but none of us do. Our salvation depends on a God who is free to intervene and work with people. What does it say in Chronicles? The eyes of the Lord rove to and fro throughout the earth, seeking to show himself mighty on behalf of those whose hearts are open towards him. You know, and I believe God is prepared to work with anybody and everybody. Now that raises a whole lot of theological issues, but we don't have time to debate those now. Okay, let's break into small groups and just with 3 or 4 people, and for the next 5 or 10 minutes have a discussion about what is the challenge in this for you. Is there anybody that feels at this stage that they need to make a public comment or raise an issue or ask a question?
I'd like to raise an issue. I've been very vocal in my small group here this morning, and I'll give them an opportunity to be vocal back. But I manage an organisation with 30 people who are generally long-term unemployed. They come to us subsidised by government work and so on for a period of between 6 and 12 months. I'm white, middle class, educated. They're generally unemployable, illiterate, Pacific Islander Maori. We're very passionate. We're a non-Christian organisation, but we bring a strong Christian ethos to it. One of our major problems is that we, in our efforts to really model Christ and assist them and educate them and employ them and set them back on the road again, is that we often end up being taken for a ride, in the sense that we get used.
Yes, I'm familiar with that experience.
And I find that difficult because we don't like to relinquish control, particularly as white middle class people. And there's
Sure.
always that barrier there. They don't feel comfortable necessarily until they really get to know us about sharing their lives.
It's where it does become mutual and vulnerable. Yeah, right. But that's where you get hurt. Yeah. That's right. So we're following somebody who got killed. You know, I mean, it may come as a surprise, but we're not looking at pain-free options here. We're looking at the most. We're not. We're looking at the options that create the greatest possibility of meeting people's basic needs. Unfortunately, these are increasingly painful. I mean, the pain of this option, let me just be clear about it, that not even Jesus was able to achieve that one in his lifetime. I mean, the pain of that is what you're working for. That's what you're praying for. May your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's what you're praying for. You're praying for transformation, right? This is, you yearn for, you long for, you sweat for, you work for that transformation. But ultimately, that kind of transformation is only possible through people being open to the Spirit and opening their lives to the Spirit. You cannot make it happen. If we use techniques to displace the Spirit and replace the Spirit to make it work, damn it, in the end, it's counterproductive. See, even when Jesus breathed on his disciples and said, receive the Spirit, they didn't get it. He actually had to say, after everything I've done with you, you need to wait. Didn't he say this? Wait until you are empowered from on high. It's only when the Spirit came that they were able to take this and make this their own. Isn't that right? And that's the difficulty. My view is this, that all our work in community development is not intervention but intercession. If we see it as intervention, we believe that we have the techniques to make it happen. But if we see it as intercession, embodied prayer, then we realise everything that we say and do is an expression of what we long for, what we yearn for, but we cannot make happen. That only God can bring about in people's lives. Somewhere, somehow, sometime. Is that clear? It's essentially a work of the Spirit from beginning to end. And that's what we need to come to terms with.